So I'm going to talk about the War Artists Advisory Committee, what it was and did during the Second World War. And I'll also talk about Evelyn Dunbar's role within the committee. She's well known for being the only woman artist that was given a salaried role by the scheme, so I'll unpick that a little bit. And I'll also talk about some examples of her work for the committee and a couple of her contemporaries as well. So we've got two title slides, competing logos. Right. So when I first started pulling together this talk, my first port of call was the IWM archive, War Artist Archive. And we have at the museum all the correspondence minutes, agendas, memos, etc., associated with the British government's official war art schemes of both world wars. And so IWM is the custodian of this incredible archive. And I pulled out Evelyn Dunbar's file, and the first entry is a letter from the artist dated 20th December 1939. And she was writing to Percy Jowett, who was a member of the War Artists Advisory Committee, and I'll explain about that work shortly. But he was also, of course, the principal of the Royal College of Art at the time. And she writes, I heard that a committee was being formed to deal with the work of artists in making war records. I am working full-time at present in my sister's shop, and I am not able to paint. I should be very glad to know if there are any possibility of work making records, say, of women's agricultural or horticultural work, or anything connected with land work. I feel I could do this with a very keen understanding. And we can't really see it very well, but Jowett's written a note saying, a very good artist who has done excellent decorations, I think he's referring to the Brookes murals, as well as drawings. So this letter does give us a bit of a flavour of the challenges for artists during wartime. Of course, work is suddenly very scarce, and it's particularly acute for those at an earlier stage in their career. And as we know, Dunbar had such promise, but when the war broke out, she was working full-time in her sister's shop. But she takes the initiative to write. So the War Artists Advisory Committee was the brainchild of Kenneth Clarke, who's the director of the National Gallery, hugely influential, of course, within the cultural sphere, patron of artists, very much at the heart of London's artistic and cultural world. And at the start of the Second World War, the British government had re-established the Ministry of Information, whose remit encompassed all government communications intended to permeate culture at home and abroad. So in all media, films, posters, radio, photojournalism, comics, advertising. And these communications were aimed at winning the trust of the general public and uniting them behind the war effort in Britain. Clarke became head of the films division and controller of home publicity. But he was also concerned about artists and finding ways to keep them employed during wartime. And he was particularly anxious about preventing artists he admired from being called up to fight. Because in the Second World War, conscription, of course, was introduced from the start of the war for men. So Clarke made the case for a war artist commissioning body within the Ministry of Information. And he was inspired by the official war art schemes of the First World War. He very much admired these in his youth. He succeeded in this mission, and in November 1939, the Ministry of Information established the War Artists Advisory Committee, with him as the chairman. So it's a couple of the more famous works from that came out of the War Artists Committee of work. But it really was a small cog in the Ministry of Information's vast remit. And some also at the ministry doubted whether art could be harnessed as an effective weapon in the communication war. And perhaps it's because its mission was not overtly propagandist. Instead of aiming to collect artworks that record, instead it aimed to collect artworks that recorded all aspects of Britain's war. And this emphasis on artworks as records, this idea that they could be objective, had its origins in the schemes of the First World War, when artists were sent out to the front as eyewitnesses. But the power attributed to war art is that it could be presented by its commissioners as an impartial medium for recording events, despite the subjective nature of art. And it was important, therefore, that artists would produce figurative works rather than abstract. They chose artists that could make drawings in situ and work them up in the studio, or those who could interpret momentous events pictorially. And collecting and commissioning war art was a subtle way of boosting morale and promoting Britain's image abroad. And there's a difference though with between Second World War art and work done before in the First World War. In the First War, official art or war art was targeted as an educated elite. But Kenneth Clarke and the War Artists Advisory Committee, they were keen to appeal to all levels of society. And this idea, he had this sort of personal mission to increase appreciation for the arts amongst the wider public. So they put on exhibitions at the National Gallery throughout the war. And these artworks also appeared in many popular touring exhibitions around the country, and were reproduced in booklets, newspapers, magazines, and even toured around the world, exhibitions around the world. Clarke's own taste played a large role. He favoured artists, his favoured artists for tackling war subjects included Graham Sutherland, Henry Moore, and Paul Nash. I've got the latter two here, examples here, whose work he saw as exemplifying spiritually English qualities. And many of the artists have worked in design, publishing, advertising, book and illustration, as Dunbar had. So the work was eye-catching, modern, proving to be accessible to a mass public. And Clarke frequently championed his sort of stable of artists in his writings, and special mention often goes to the three I've mentioned. And I think it's fair to say that employing women artists and tackling female subjects was something of an afterthought, but of its time, and a time when women's place in society was marginalised and less public, and of course was changing. So how did Clarke's committee go about collecting and commissioning works? There were three different ways they engaged artists. The first was these full-time salaried artists. They were given 6-month contracts at a time that were often renewed. So eventually Dunbar would be appointed on this basis. That was later on, that was the start of 1943. Many of the men also were engaged later, but there were some like Eric Villiers, Edward Borden, the Nash brothers, Barnett Friedman, Edward Ardesoni, who were contracted in early 1940. And secondly, there were artists on short-term specific contracts, and that's how even Dunbar started out before she gained her salary position. And there are many well-known artists in this group, including Laura Knight and Dorothy Coke. Stanley Spencer, Henry Moore was one of those as well. And thirdly, artists could also make work independently and send it in for consideration. So the Zinkaisen sisters, Doris and Anna, were in this group. They were successful artists before the war. Doris worked in theatre design and costume, and Anna advertising and illustration. And both during the war, they worked as auxiliary nurses at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington, making and submitting paintings to the committee in their spare time. So we have a few by them, and famously Doris went on to work for the Red Cross in 1945, and she was present at Bergen-Belsen when it was liberated. Some truly remarkable paintings came out of that. But that's an aside. So the War Artists Advisory Committee was a large project, and there were 400 artists represented by the end of the war, and around 5,500 works of art were collected by the scheme. And as I mentioned before, Clarke's view of war art was a singularly masculine one. There were just 52 of the women, 52 artists were women, and that works out at about 13%. And this was not, it was a reflection of wider societal attitudes, but not simply that. Throughout the first half of the century, for example, women were outnumbered men as students at the slade school. And while the number of artists working and exhibiting in Britain estimated to be around a third of the total were women. And women, of course, made up the majority of home front subjects, which was a popular subject for the committee. So more opportunities could have been given. However, because the committee's endeavour was on such a large scale, that still leaves us with many works about and by women in the collection. So apologies, just to not cram the screen, I haven't put all the titles. So if you do want to know them, just ask me later and I'll let you know. Here is the advertisement. This is the announcement that went out in the Times in April 1940, announcing Evelyn Dunbar and all these other artists who were given short-term contracts. Clark and the WAC also had a little bit of a nudge on portraying women by Lady Norman, who was a trustee of the IWM and suffragist who'd been instrumental in establishing the museum's Women's Work Committee in the First World War. So she lobbied the War Artists Advisory Committee to cover the women's services, and as the museum itself had no funds at all during this time. And of course, so following her letter, Evelyn Dunbar was interviewed and taken on, and of course she was absolutely delighted. Writing to the committee, it's very encouraging to have a prospect of work of this kind. And her first contract was for 6 pictures of women's voluntary services subjects, and she was to be paid 50 guineas for this work. So the Women's Voluntary Service, her first work that was accepted by the committee, was founded in 1938 by Lady Reading, and she meets with Evelyn Dunbar, Ethel Gabain and Dorothy Cope, the first 3 women artists who were chosen. And the idea with the Women's Voluntary Service, they recruited women into the ARP movement, the Air Raid Precautions movement, and they staffed the emergency rest centres, gave out food, first aid, and assisted with children's evacuation. And Dunbar's first assignment was to one of these training centres at Bisham Abbey near Marlow in Buckinghamshire. And obviously, in the early part of the war, fear of chemical weapons loomed large, and everybody was equipped with gas masks. And here's a member of the ambulance crew getting ready, and of course it employs this these boxes, this compartmentalized device that she's used before, that Jill was showing us. And it works a different way. It shows the various stages of the woman getting ready, and this sequence really animates the scene, but it also it makes this painting so informative and educational. We know that she goes on to, with a book of farm craft, her drawings and paintings are very informative in the way they work, and it really demystifies what is a frightening prospect. Really, it brings a levity to the situation and a note of reassurance. And we see at the end the determination on her face, with her head held high. And then following this, this was accepted, and then she was sent on to Sparsholt Farm Institute near Winchester to start depicting the work of the Women's Land Army. And we can see on the left, this is a painting that Jill was talking about earlier, with Josie Loosemore and her milk churn. At this point, Evelyn writes, she makes all her drawings on site, and she said, I found some excellent material here. And she also was always very appreciative to the committee. I continue to be most grateful for the opportunity which the Artists Advisory Committee have given me. And the one on the right, Milking, is actually on loan at the moment to the Wellcome Collection. They have an exhibition on milk at the moment, so it's quite intriguing. But it's a fantastic work, and what's interesting at this stage are these 2 and another 2 are accepted by the committee, and out of a total of 8, so 4 out of 8, and they are all interior scenes. So although she has this great interest in the land, she has a real gift for making these interior scenes work, and it's a highly original interpretation, and it shows the breadth of her interest, really, her very keen understanding, not solely being on the land, engaged with nature, but also the very practical aspects of the agricultural work. And yes, Sparshot's where she first gets the idea to make the book of farmcraft, and she does write to the secretary of the committee asking about how she might go about that. And of course she meets her husband as well here, Roger Foley. So in September 1940, that's the summer she made those work, she writes again, and she said, saying there are now women's activities going on in connection with relief for air raid victims. So of course, September 1940, the start of the Blitz, in which I'm helping, and which also provides subjects for drawings and paintings. I propose to include some of these in my work for you. And in the same letter, you kind of get a bit of an insight into her character, or just how people really spoke in those days. She writes, "We have been through very stirring, or perhaps trying is a better word, times down here. As I expect you are too now in London." And when she signs off, she writes, "I hope all goes well with you through these very difficult times." So this painting, Knitting Party, really shows, you know, her mastery of composition and social observations. Christopher Campbell Howes has written that this is set in the Dunbar's living room in the Cedars, and she's really expanded the space for the sake of the artwork. It's a really chilling and austere, chilly, a bit different, chilly and austere scene. And the ladies in their hats are perfectly placed to lead the eye around the painting and balance the composition. And the atmosphere evoked, I think, is so sort of subtly powerful in the midst of such trying times as Dunbar describes them. Here is solemn duty and the stiff upper lip personified, really exemplified. And by depicting the efforts of these women and their knitting blankets, the khaki and navy blankets, Dunbar is representing an overlooked aspect of British wartime society, and it is quiet, and it has a potent atmosphere. And she's really astute at this social observation and humour, of course. In this realm, these women may be dutiful, but it's not joyful, is it? They're not really seem to be enjoying each other's company very much. It's very quiet. So this one, and as I mentioned, the other two we just saw, and one other, the canning demonstration, were accepted in January 1941 by the committee. By August 1941, the committee decided to commission Dunbar to tackle nursing subjects. And this is the first time there's a very particular request. They wanted a painting of a hospital train, and they actually specified train 21. It was especially interesting, where the nurses are waiting in case of casualties due to an air raid in the sidings just in East London, and the train could be taken into the centre of London and deal with all the casualties. So they're making good use of their time waiting, knitting in here. And around this time, she's found it difficult to obtain canvas, and you can't see on this slide, but it's incredibly coarse, this canvas that she's used. It's incredible. She's managed to paint in any sort of detail or sensitivity at all, because it's incredibly coarse. And she describes some of the samples she received as like wire netting or worse. And I included this because Peter sent this photograph to me as he met somebody, Amanda Stevens, whose recent PhD thesis is on rail carriage interiors of the period, and she thinks this was the sort of this stock LNER tourist stock 1938 was the same one. And Peter has his doubts, but I think this is quite interesting because it's an example of how she uses what she needs. I'm convinced it probably is this, and she's taken away the wings because it doesn't serve her composition. There's so many other similarities, but that's just an aside for the train nerds. But it's very difficult also to do an interior of a train and the perspective that's involved. So a lot of things have to be tweaked to make it right. And she succeeds on something that was a very prescriptive commission here. So this is St Thomas's Hospital in evacuation quarters that she painted in 1942. And it's at the same time that she had the previous picture accepted. She actually writes to the committee and proposes this idea. She wanted to visit Pierford, which is near Woking in Surrey, where St Thomas's Hospital, based in London, had been evacuated to. And she writes, "Where there seems to be every branch of nursing represented, I have a great idea for a large picture, and I know a nurse there who would give me some assistance." So it's really showing her ambitions that she has this idea and she's taking initiative. And by the beginning of May 42, she's found a great deal of interesting material. And she writes, "I'm now about to embark on the great work." And but she finds it slow going. She writes, the subjects were so completely unfamiliar to me, and it has taken some time to feel at home in them. My first entry into hospital life made such an odd and vivid impression on me, that I'm hoping to be able to transmit something of it pictorially. Christopher Campbell Howes has written about Dunbar's mother taking up Christian Science when she was a child and emptying all their medicine bottles down the sink. And luckily from then on, the family were blessed with good health. That hadn't been the case before. But he remarks that she's perhaps an odd choice for a commission because of her Christian Science background. She just didn't know anything about this world. But I'm sure it was the female link that led the committee to ask her to tackle this subject. And although it's not such a natural fit, perhaps, as the agricultural subjects, it's obviously fascinating for Dunbar, and she really took the subject on. And later, when she was asked to describe the painting, she concludes, the whole is a scene of everyday hospital tasks, a flat checkered background with its wreath of crisply white apron figures moving deftly and swiftly over it. Browns, greens, blues, scarlet and white. I feel perhaps it's not the best image of it, probably brighter than this actually, with a few sharp blacks and spottings of delicate pink. So it seemed to me. Wish I could do it again. I'd do something a lot better. And this is when she wrote to the secretary of the committee in January 1944. And it is indeed a highly complex and ambitious painting. And she really wanted to do justice to the range of tasks and activities she observed there at the hospital. But perhaps the result is too much for the view to make sense as a whole. And perhaps it's in some ways, despite its complexity, it's not her most successful work. But even if she was disappointed in it, it doesn't quite match up to her ambitions. It remains a remarkable achievement. And the committee very warmly approved it when they accepted it. Women's conscription was introduced in December 1941, and it did not affect all of the War Artists Advisory Committee women artists, since it only applied to unmarried women and childless widows between the ages of 20 and 30. But the committee were obviously concerned that Dunbar would be called up. And so from late 1941 onwards, they start considering offering her a salaried position that would prevent this from happening, prevent her from being called up. And in fact, as we know, she did get married to Roger Foley in August 1942. But it didn't affect the threat of call up by then. I think they just needed people, and they didn't have children either. So the committee did drag their feet. They didn't offer it straight away. But once they approved the St Thomas picture we saw before, and another hospital train picture in October 1942, they gave her a raise. They doubled her fee from 35 guineas to 70 guineas and offered her the 6-month contract for the first time. And the 6-month contract is £325, same as other salaried artists. And they arranged for her to meet Kenneth Clark himself. And she writes that she's rather overwhelmed. I get the impression she's a bit of a hard taskmaster on herself. She didn't think she was giving them more than their money's worth. And secondly, she was delighted with the offer of more work. And she writes, it is a privilege to be doing this work, and I shall do my utmost on it. The committee will know how grateful I am to be given further opportunities. And so she's sent back to do agricultural subjects again, and her contract started in January 1943. She goes to the Institute of Agriculture in Usk in South Wales, where she writes, there's plenty going on, and she has a caravan on the site that she lives in. And this, but she also travelled to other places, Gloucestershire, Berwickshire, and this Land Army Girls painting is one of the first she did under the new contract. But by May of that year, she's running out of time. She's getting rather anxious, and she asked if she can continue working once the 6 months are up. She just felt that she hadn't produced enough work to justify the fee. And of course, they said, fine, carry on working for no extra money. And at this point, I want to just quick dive into some of her contemporaries' work, a quick comparison, because I was interested about her. It just so happens that most of the works we have at the IWM, except just one, they're all interior works, and I wanted to compare them to the interiors of Eric Bilius, who's been much celebrated recently. But immediately I'm struck that Dunbar's work has a much higher level of humanity. And maybe it's a little bit unfair. The bottom left is not probably the best example of Revilius's work. But I wanted to look about how someone's filled in the thank you very much whoever did that, the titles here for me. But I wanted to look at how he handled the group scenes within an interior setting, and he's clearly a master of atmosphere and light. So the one on the right, I think, is one of his strongest of his wartime years. But there is certainly a chill, there's a lack of presence in his depiction of people. He's interested in the design. So if I quickly zip back to Knitting Party, I just wanted to try and imagine Revilius tackling this subject. You know, the figures would have been relegated to the periphery. They certainly would have been secondary to the room itself. She's able to do everything, isn't she? It's true that she does create a frosty atmosphere, but this comes from her powers of social observation, not something that Revilius was interested in. And her skill also is that she doesn't need many details to the faces. Of course, we've heard she didn't like depicting faces, but the character comes out from the body language, really. That she's a master of body language and expressing group characteristics and dynamics. And then the other comparison, other end of the spectrum, from Revilius is Edward Ardisoni, who's all about humanity and social observation. And these are quite gentle. He could be rather disdainful and sexist in some of his works. And obviously he's an illustrator first and foremost. And the way he worked, he had ready-made characters and vignettes at his disposal, sort of types, and they were preconceived and employ them at will to the situations that he found himself in. And his witty observations were well received and understood, but of course they do not have the depth of Dunbar's work. And if you want any of these titles, just come to me later. Thought we'd just crowd the slide a bit. So getting back to Dunbar, I mean, it's a sophisticated vision, isn't it? This work is one of her most well known, I think, from the Second World War, The Queue at the Fish Shop, and it's of the High Street in Rochester. And we know it started in early 1942, and eventually submitted to the WAC in 1945. And so she just keeps coming back to it, and all these other things going on. In the meantime, she's given another 6-month commission that seems to give her a bit of anxiety because she wasn't ready. And so by October 1943, she's ready for another. Well, she's not ready for another 6-month commission. They would like her to do another one. And she writes, in order to do the requisite number in 6 months, I should have to paint one medium-sized picture every 10 days unfailingly, allowing no time for travel, delays, or getting to know the subjects, which are sometimes quite new to me. And thus, if I did one every month, it would take me 16 months to earn my commission fee. And she writes she was making shorthand scribbles instead of penetrating drawings. We know her working practice is all about making many, many drawings before she brought them back to the studio. But ultimately, despite this pressure, she knows she doesn't want to produce hasty work, but something more deeper. And she appeals to the secretary of the committee for advice. And he reassures her that she should go at her own pace, complete the work when it's done, and when they're ready, they'll give her another commission. It doesn't quite work like that. They backdate us to her contract. I think it does add extra stress to her. But anyway, thank goodness it didn't put her off too much. And she produces some really great work right at the end of the war. So this work shows her mastery of so many things: the use of colour, as movement. It's a successful composition. It's a long, narrow format which emphasises the cue, but it's quite difficult to do. And of course, there's the humour as well. But it is a personal work as well. The RAF man here on the bicycle is Roger, her husband, and then there's a self-portrait, which is an incredibly bold statement for a piece of war art. You know, what could this mean really? We know that the fish shop itself is empty. There's no fish there yet, but everyone's anticipating there will be. You know, it shows difficult times, but people aren't brought down by this. And if she's thinking that eventually this work will be accepted by the committee and then shown to future generations, it's a record, then maybe she's just looking out at us now. You know, this is what it was like. This is what happened. So, but yeah, she's capturing optimism in spite of everything, really. And again, social observation. And finally, oh, it does say there's a tiny caption there. This is a land girl and the Bale Ball from 1945, and it's one of her final submissions to the committee. It was completed in time for the Royal Academy exhibition right at the end of after the war ended. And she returned to Sparsholt Farm Institute, where she worked at the start. This work actually didn't go to the IWM at the end of the war. It went to the Tate. They generally got the better works. You know, we got some wonderful works too, but they sort of were really impressive works, and this really, you know, is viewed as such. You know, where in the fish queue she's confronting the viewer, here the land girl and the Bale Ball are confronting each other. You can't see it very well, but you know, you can actually see the ball's eyes looking right up at her. And she's really sort of elevating and celebrating the bravery of ordinary people, because this is actually dangerous work. So she described it later. It is imaginative painting of a land girl's work with an outdoor dairy herd on the Hampshire Downs. The bale is the movable shed in the middle where the milking is done. Soon after dawn in the early summer, the girl has to catch and tether the bull. She entices him with a bucket of fodder and hides the chain behind her, ready to snap on the ring in his nose as soon as it is within her reach. So, you know, Jill's saying that they don't have much training and having to do things like this, you know, it's incredibly brave. And so this is her tribute. And of course, the sky is incredible. It's described as a mackerel sky in some of the writings I've read. And she's trying to show this early morning in the summer, which I think it really does well with the light as well. There's a real majesty to this painting. And it's her sister Jessie that posed as the land girl. So I'll try and conclude a little here. I think it is significant, and it isn't significant, that she was the only woman to be given a salaried position. Her framing of her subjects, her attitude to their wartime task, to getting on in a home front, doing your bit, chimed well with the committee's aims. They wanted work that was accessible, could be understood by the public, and also supported the notion of Britain as a plucky island nation who wouldn't be worn down. This is very potent stuff. It's still there today. But her slow, planned, and methodical approach to producing paintings was certainly not like some of the other prominent wartime artists. Ardizoni, Edward Borden, Anthony Gross, whose work she admired, the War Artists exhibition. They work quickly and mostly in a different medium, watercolour. They're not all salaried war artists were like that. There's quite an extreme example. They did commission William Coldstream, known for his very slow, painstaking approach to portrait painting. He was sent to Italy. I was a bit intrigued. I wonder what the conversations were there, but unfortunately there wasn't much detail on the file, so that's frustrating. Dunbar was conscientious. She saw the salaries relating to the number of works produced, not the time period. I'm not sure what would have happened if she hadn't brought up how few paintings she had produced in that time. Like many of her contemporaries, the challenges of the task and the unfamiliarity of the situation of war, perhaps the importance of the work, the focus it gave artists during wartime, meant that she produced some of her best work. She was ambitious, and she looked to not simply meet the parameters of the commission, but exceed them. And ultimately, the committee's patronage was an endorsement of her methods, and they had faith in her vision. And yeah, she's one of amongst IWM curators, she's one of our most important artists. We really value her work. You know, we long time wished, it was Angela's idea to put on an exhibition of hers. It's not come to fruition, and there's long and boring stories of why that hasn't happened. But we do, you know, as professionals at the museum, we really appreciate her work, and she's very important to us.